Today we're going to talk about how to save 80% or more by migrating your data center into GCP. My name is Jamie Seide. I'm chief of staff with Optiva, and I've been here for about 2 years, and I've been focused on the operational side of private equity for about 5 years. My role is to look at the cost and expense side of the businesses that we get involved in. Typically, these are financially distressed, bankrupt, out of cash. No other private equity or venture capital group wants to touch them. So we were very excited when we found Optiva. It was deeply financially distressed, but the core product was really good, which made it a great fit for our type of turnaround.
And I'm Keith Miller. I'm the Senior Vice President of Pythian Services business, and we were the services provider who was chosen to help Optiva in this migration to GCP.
So just to set the stage, what is it that Optiva does? When you place a phone call or use data on your mobile phone, there's a split second where your carrier has to determine who are you prepaid, postpaid, are you one of my subscribers, somebody else's? How am I going to get paid? It's not a particularly sexy piece of software, but it's super important. If it goes down, then either the carrier has to not let anything go through, and then all the subscribers get super grumpy, or the carrier lets things go through, but they don't get paid. So uptime is super important. In terms of what we're bringing to the table post-turnaround for innovation, we're taking this and moving it to public cloud. So Telco is a very conservative, risk-averse space, and they also have to provision for peak load. So not anything particularly new, but from our perspective, we're like, well, why don't you move to somewhere where you can you can provision for the load that you actually need. So instead of provisioning for Mother's Day, which happens once a year and is multiples of what they need the rest of the year, they can scale up and scale down. So we have 100 plus customers all over the world, billions of transactions per hour at peak. Here's some of our customers. One of the things that's been interesting for me in getting involved in this business, I follow world events a lot more closely than I used to. So if there's a coup or a civil war or whatever, we have customers in Afghanistan and Yemen and Venezuela, all over the place. And I'm much more aware of what's happening now because it impacts our customers immediately.
Sure, I'll just give you some insight as to Pythian's sort of the opportunity we see on Google Cloud Platform. We're 20 years in business, 400 employees, 350 customers globally, but it really kind of wraps up in the love your data tagline. So we've always been good at focusing on where the data is or where it's going, and right now we see a lot of data going to GCP. So that's what we're excited about with the Google opportunity. What do we do? What does Pythian do on GCP? There's really two main scenarios. One is the one we're talking about today with Optiva, moving bare metal or VMs from on-prem into GCP, and that can be either onto Google Cloud Compute Engine or onto Kubernetes. So that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. The other piece is there's a lot of optimism in the market around what the cloud provides as a next generation analytics platform. So leveraging things like BigQuery on GCP, linking your legacy data sources to that data warehouse, and then using tools like Looker, Tableau to gain those insights once you've got the real-time streaming infrastructure in place. For all of those scenarios, there's really some key things that we talk about all the time. Security. How do you set up Google Security Console from day one and have people attending to those alerts 24/7? Same with OpViz, Stackdriver, setting that up on day one, and then dealing with those 24/7. And really the order of magnitude change or complexity that comes with cloud is quite apparent to us. So evolutionary services. Once you've got a stack set up in GCP, coming in on a quarterly basis and saying, okay, here's what's changed. Here are the new pieces that are available. Here's the ones we suggest you drop, or here's the new ones that you adopt. So that's just sort of how Pythian looks at the GCP opportunity.
So what was the mess that we started with? When we got involved, the company was spending about $15 million a year on data center, which with a base of revenue of about 150 million, and the company wasn't a SaaS company, 15 million a year is a lot. 10 data centers, tens of thousands of square foot of space, millions a year on electricity, 100 engineers just to supporting the data centers. This type of location proliferation is not actually unusual when you've got a company that's formed by multiple successive acquisitions. Each division that comes in brings with it its own data centers, its own team, and each team feels that they have specific, unique expertise that's very hard to replace, which they do have specific expertise, and it is hard to replace. But if you don't have the discipline to consolidate, then over time, eventually you get to spending $15 million a year and just hemorrhaging money. So our big idea, for those of you who read Built to Last back in the 90s, the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal was to save 90%, going from $15 million a year to $1.5 million a year in 6 months. We met with the team that was there at the time we got involved and said, okay, how can we shrink this 15 million? And they said, well, if we do this, we can save 10%. And then if we do this, we can get to 20. And if we get really aggressive, maybe we can get to 30 or 40%. We said, and how long is that going to take? And they're like 2, maybe 3 years, if we're really disciplined. We're like, we're bleeding here. We can't wait that long. So instead, what we said was, let's move everything possible to GCP. And then everything that can't move to GCP, let's pick one data center and centralize there, and then optimize like crazy after that. So how do you move 10 data centers into Google? Well, step 0 really is pick your cloud provider, and it's worth mentioning why we picked Google. Our customers, as I mentioned, are telcos. They're very risk averse, and so they're dealing with super sensitive personal data, name, phone number, location, and so they can't have data breaches. So when you walk in and you're able to point to the huge investment that Google has made in security, that helps de-escalate that, especially if you can walk in with Google people to talk about that. So that takes that off the table. The next reason we picked Google was the native products. So we spend a ton on Oracle every year, and we'd prefer to spend like 0. So we started experimenting with Spanner, and we found that we got better performance, the price was better, and we got better reliability, which is a trifecta that you just don't find very often.
On that topic, an interesting part of this is this Oracle to Spanner migration. One of the things you hear about Spanner is because it's the replication anywhere idea, but you've got GDPR compliance issue. How did you deal with Spanner in that setup?
Yeah, so that comes up with most of the conversations we have, and at least initially, we're keeping people in one region. So if you want to be in Europe, then stay within the European zones. Originally, we were thinking, Amsterdam and England, but with Brexit, that gets a little more complicated. But just stay within the region for now. And then as we get down the road a little further, we're looking at actually leveraging, what's the new name for GKE on-prem? Anthos. Okay, yes. Potentially leveraging a small footprint on the telco side and then cleansing the data before it goes up. So then there's not even anything that's super sensitive in GCP. But there's ways around it. It shouldn't be a blocker. So that's step 0. Step 1 is pick your partner. Then lift and shift with a double bubble, which I'll get to in a minute, and then consolidate and optimize like crazy. So as far as the migration partner, we looked at a lot of vendors, not just 3, but we looked at 3 really seriously. And we picked Pythian because they have a deep relationship with Google, and that type of kind of stamp of approval was meaningful for us. And then they had the best price and the best approach. And so this is worth unpacking a little bit. It's not that they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. It's that they had a world-class team of really outstanding resources, but it was an elastic team. We didn't have to pay for the whole team the whole time. So they rolled on, rolled off. And then they also invested deeply in automation so that you make the use of the team up front and then automate after that.
Yeah, the 17,000 virtual machines is a big number, so we called it Brave. It didn't really scare us that much. If you were here last year, you might have seen us talking about the BlackBerry Messenger migration that was done around the world. So very similar sort of application footprint, not as tight a timeline as this one. The other good thing about the sales cycle, if you will, was how we were both very outcomes focused, not talking about hours, and it was very outcomes focused. And we really Pythian saw this as a great fit for both. We have services that we can deliver on-prem and then remote, and we definitely saw the scale of this requiring an remote component.
Yeah, and actually, that riffing on that a little bit, one of the other things we liked about Pythian was they were very accountable. There were multiple, actually a lot of checkpoints where if we felt it wasn't working, we could just stop working with them and do it ourselves. And that type of confident, accountable commitment was enormously appealing to us.
Okay, so how was the planning side? Probably 3 years ago, you would see a lot of people talking about my cloud migration methodology. And yes, that's important. Yes, we have a methodology. It's just not as important as it was back then. Now it really comes down to you really need to leverage native components if you're going to have a successful migration. So, what is the knowledge on the native side? The other one is the execution side. You're talking 17,000 machines. So how are you going to execute that? So planning becomes more than just meetings. It becomes a mix of what are the human and software mixes you're going to bring in to actually execute it in the timeline.
Actually, we'll get to this a little bit later, but we broke all of the machines down into easy, medium, hard, very hard. And the easy ones represented the bulk of the machines, but we'll dive into this a little bit more later. So what is the double bubble? This is the thing that your CEO and CFO will hate. So the idea is, great, I'm going to migrate to the cloud and I will immediately start spending less money. That is not what is going to happen. Let's say you're at N or at 100 on this graph. You're going to go from spending that, and then you're going to ramp up your destination data center and resources, and you're going to spend more, and then you're going to ramp up your migration partner and you're going to spend more. So you'll get from N to 1.5N or 2N. And so on this graph, the area that is above the 100, that's the double bubble. And if you don't plan for it, it will bite you in the butt and you're going to have a bad time. It might seem a little counterintuitive to also add the migration partner on there. You're like, that's more expensive. If you don't do that, and we have done this without migration partners before with other companies, it just takes longer and you end up spending more on the double bubble. That migration partner is definitely a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, we experience this in our personal lives. Like if you move houses, you have an overlap where you own two houses and you're probably paying a moving company in the middle also. And I've never heard it referred to as the double bubble, but it is hopefully a phrase that catches on. One of the themes we're going to get into is just if you're going to take on a migration of this size, it has to be not just sponsored or supported by the C-level. It needs to be owned by the C-level. Because this bubble is meaningful amounts of money. I mean, this graph is not to scale.
Right.
But it's a meaningful amount of money. And if there is delays in the process, then you want C-level support for it, that the destination is worth the double bubble and stay the course. If it's just owned in IT, for example, then you can have C-level concern, anxiety, a lot of awkward discussions that is going to make it more difficult to get through the double bubble.
Yeah. For us, the double bubble was about 6 months and about $3 million. So not a small amount of money. One thought on how you shorten this, I already mentioned using a migration partner. I also recommend, when you look, if you've got multiple data centers you're migrating, you can either say, okay, here they all are, and I'm going to take all the machines of this type and move them up, and then this type and move them up, etc. I strongly recommend instead saying, I'm going to take this data center, the whole thing, I'm going to move everything up that I can, and everything that can't move, we'll move it to our consolidation data center, and then turn it off. You can immediately turn off the electricity. You can not renew your lease. You can look at, can I sublease, shrink my footprint there, and you can start to release the team or the portions of the team that you don't need anymore. So you can start chunking cost out, which for us with 10 data centers, that was impactful.
Okay, so we talked about humans and software. So we did use an automation migration service for this. And a POC. So the humans are important to figure out the first ones, and software is great at taking, once it's figured out, let software run it again and again and again. This is a bit of a busy slide. We broke it out into a bunch of slides so you can understand what it is. But basically, humans proved out each system type, and that was categorized, and then an inventory was executed against. So the inventory, it actually wasn't that shocking a piece of technology. I think it was just Google Sheets that we wrote these systems into. Some of them were super easy to inventory and through software. Others were very hard. And I think you're going to get into that later, Jamie, about that. so that was all written in inventory. That was the execution plan. Then the automation service looked at that inventory, pulled server names from it. A automation agent was attempted to be installed on the on-premise machine. If that was successful, then you kept going. If not, it was put in the deal with later bucket, basically the human attendant bucket. The agent would then replicate that, that OS instance, would take it to GCS, Google Cloud Storage. Once that was verified as a real image, it was then taken and instantiated in GCE, Google Compute Engine, as a VM. And that would be then flagged into the inventory as OK, and then not OKs were then sent for human involvement later. And that's really how, and it was an iterative process because new inventory would show up as the process was executing. Engineers had to handle the exception. So the obvious question that everyone asks is, what was your success rate? And it's kind of as you would think. For the systems that were quite well understood, recent versions of Windows, recent versions of Linux, we had about a 90% success rate. And then the ones that were older versions of those had about an 80% failure rate. So you can imagine where your humans were spending their time was all on the exceptions, and the sort of rote Windows and rote Linux boxes were very much handled through the migration process. So that's how you get that many machines moved in, well, call it 6 months.
Yeah. So some challenges we encountered during the migration. If you boil it down, it's the middle one. There was just too much crap there. We had a business that was formed by multiple acquisitions and bolt-ons. And so we had more than 50 flavors of OS, all sorts of different varieties of Linux and Windows, but also AIX, HPUX, Solaris. So we said, all right, everything that's on Windows, upgrade to a recent version that will be supported, and keep only 1 or 2 versions and be disciplined about that. Do the same thing with Linux. And then for all of your other flavors of operating system, do you really, really need it? Like really, really? Can you shut that down? Can you move that load onto something else? And in some cases we could. Can you refactor? But in the cases where you couldn't, fine, keep it on bare metal, consolidate in one data center. So we went from 50 plus flavors down to about 10. So we had 80% reduction there. And then on the too much crap side, there's a mindset with physical data centers where, hey, I bought all this stuff. If I'm not using it, I'm kind of wasting the resource that I paid for. So I might as well use it. And if there isn't real discipline on the team, then you can fill that up. And then the team that's managing the data center says, oh my God, we're at 95% utilization. We should maybe buy some more hardware. So then you buy more. And then you use that, et cetera. So the way we handled this was we did a physical inventory, which takes actually longer than we expected it to. And then we had departments have to claim each machine and explain why it needed to be migrated. And then everything that didn't get claimed, we turned off. And then inevitably, hands were raised. I do actually need that, and here's why. And that's fine. We're not trying to be jerks about it. It was more just, hey, let's not migrate anything that isn't truly needed. We cut our migration effort by about 50% just doing this, which realistically, this exercise probably should have been an annual one or more frequent than that anyway, but it cut our effort a lot. Then tiny pipes, I'm sure all of you have lots of data. We certainly did. And if you try and push that over the pipe that is good for day-to-day use, it's going to take forever. Strong recommendation is to use the Google Transfer Appliance if that works for you. So I think that's in North America, and I think it's in beta in Europe. So we used it in North America and we used it in Europe. For those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, it's a big box that has a bunch of storage on it. It shows up at your data center. You load your data in, ship it back to Google, and then they load it. In India, where that wasn't available, we used a GCP partner called, I'm going to mispronounce that, but I think it's SIFI.
SIFI, yeah.
Yeah. And that cut our migration time, increased the pipe size and cut our migration time from about 7 months down to 6 weeks.
Yeah, sorry, just if I could add on to the tiny pipes picture. this from our teams, we see this as being a chronic problem in a lot of migrations. Is when you're moving that many VMs, think about root C drives, how much data that is that you're going to be moving. It's certainly not going to be the bandwidth you use on a daily basis, right? But it's not just the bandwidth; it's the resiliency of that network. Like one of the things we ran into in this was a network equipment component failure, which it failed. We tried to troubleshoot it. At some point, you just have to give up on troubleshooting, and we just put in a new one. We replaced it, and I'm not even sure if we ever figured out what the problem of it was. But we would have found that if we had run like a 2-day hammer test to battle test the network. And that's, I think, sometimes there's easy to do the calculations on the bandwidth that you've set up from a provider, but do you have, all the failure points of a network, and making sure that you have run a multi-day test against that. On the networking side also, yes, the data transfer appliance does work very well, and we recommend using that. It is kind of networking. Lock down the components, lock down security as much as you can before you move, and then also don't give more internet access than you had on-prem. Even though the cloud might tend to make you do that, if you have a limited amount of internet access, perhaps none, don't change that. As you move over, is sort of another networking tip.
Yeah, totally agree. Too slow, need robots. So we had thousands of machines we needed to migrate. If we had done this by hand, as a friend of mine says, lovingly handcrafted, it would have taken ages, and there definitely would have been human error, and then the knock-on effects would have been unpredictable and not good. So for a migration of any scale, you've got to invest in automation. And then dog ate my password. This was a problem with the inventorying and with the automation. We were a turnaround situation and bleeding money, and we couldn't afford to wait. And so by the time we actually started the data center migration, a lot of the team that had been managing some of those machines were gone. So I think we had like 20% of our machines we didn't have the passwords for. So we had to send people into the data centers to reset those. And it wasn't like we identified all of them at once and did it in batch. It was kind of, we discovered it and sent someone in, and then discovered it and sent someone in. So recommendation would be make sure that you have the passwords up front, which seems like a no-brainer, but it can bite you in the butt. So now I'm in GCP. Now what? So it can be a bit of a runaway roller coaster if you're not careful. You've got a team that's used to, hey, there's this resource, and there's almost no incremental cost if I spin up more stuff in that, to now everything you spin up costs you money, and you can burn a lot of cash very, very quickly if you're not careful. So the first recommendation here is, like you said, lock it down. So lock down the internet access, but in terms of provisioning new resources, nobody gets rights to do this anymore. It's centralized to your SaaS ops team. Have a request system, or the form or whatever, where people say, I want this. This is how much resource I want. This is the project it's for. This is the layer of the application it's for. This is my budget. This is how long I need it for. And yeah, it's a pain in the butt, and there'll be some pushback initially, but then the team gets on board with it, and they're fine. If you don't do this, you're going to have a bad time, I promise you. And this then ties into labeling all of the resources, and then you can monitor and keep track of, are you staying above or below your budget target? As far as reduce and simplify, we had 4 different support ticket tracking systems. We had 8 different source control systems. We had 120 plus RDP boxes, and kind of the list goes on, right? So we said, okay, we're going to adopt one ticket tracking system, and we're going to move from 8 down to 1 source control system. And we're going to go from 120 RDP servers down to 4, et cetera, right? Take that approach everywhere you can to converge onto one system for a given function, and to make more efficient use of the resources.
On those, you had the easy through most difficult systems in your, at the bottom, one of the casualties was the HP UX boxes. I'm assuming someone made a compelling case that those had to stay and had to move. How did you deal with that?
I don't remember exactly what they were being used for, but I think it was one of the source control systems. And so we turned them off. So that took care of that.
So just back to the sea level.
Yeah.
I need to get to a destination that has a good cost footprint and driving that through.
Yeah. Yeah. So once you've done your consolidation, set extreme goals. So I mentioned earlier that the team that had been there when we got involved, their approach was, well, we can get 10, 20, 30% improvement. If you set extreme goals, it forces people to be creative. They have to reevaluate their assumptions and say, God, if I'm going to get 90%, how am I even going to do that? Maybe we don't need this system. Maybe we can consolidate, as opposed to, yeah, we'll keep everything, but can we just be a little more efficient? So set the goalposts out there. And this is another place that you need that C-suite buy-in, because if you don't have that and you set extreme goals, someone's going to go screaming, up the flagpole, and then you'll get pushback. So how do you optimize? First one is easy, right? Take advantage of the GCP pricing hooks. So use sustained use discounts, committed use discounts. If you don't need something to be outside of the US, keep your load in the US. You'll get the best pricing that way. Those are the easy ones. Monitor everything. So everything has to be tagged. Monitor CPU, memory, disk utilization. I used to work at Dell like 15 years ago, and Michael Dell's big thing is if you can measure it, you can improve it. So make sure you are measuring everything, and that way you can track. How much have I spent on this? What's my velocity? Am I going to go above or below my budget for the quarter? And it's okay, if you're tracking to go above it. Maybe you need to, but you can catch it soon enough that you can adjust course and dial back other stuff, or maybe you're going over budget in a bad way and you can catch that fast. And then being ruthlessly efficient. So replatform Windows to Linux, which is a hassle, but do it. You'll save money. Delete unattached disks every day. Delete snapshots and images as soon as they're not needed. If you don't need solid state, don't use it. And there's valid reasons to use solid state. So I'm not saying don't use it, but if you don't need it, don't use it. It costs more. And then make use of the recommendations that GCP gives you. They'll say, hey, this machine is only running at 20% CPU utilization. Maybe you should shrink it. Use those. Don't rely exclusively on that. You're going to want to do your own analysis, but definitely make use of that. Automate. So we've talked about automation during migration. Automation afterwards is also important. We now auto-terminate anything that isn't labeled. Initially, we weren't enforcing the labeling. So when we put this policy in, we gave people a heads up. And we're like, okay, after this point, things will be terminated. And then we would give them, for the first 2 or 3 cycles, we said, hey, these resources aren't labeled. We're going to turn them off tomorrow. Now we don't even wait. If it's not labeled properly, it gets killed. Also look for kind of standard patterns of use. So you can probably turn the machines off at night that your engineers are using and on the weekend. It's not that they can't turn them back on if they need to work late at night or over the weekend, but turn that stuff off if it's not needed. Look for other patterns like if your testing team only needs the testing environment in the first and third week of the month, great. Turn that environment off the rest of the time. And then use auto-scaling smartly. That can be helpful too. On the second one, go GCP native. So there's 2 mindsets here. One mindset is I really want to stay agnostic, right? I don't want to get fully committed to one cloud provider because then I'm locked in and I lose pricing pressure. That's not the direction we went, because if you do that, then you can't take advantage of all the great things that the cloud provider brings to the table. For us with GCP, Spanner is phenomenal, right? It's a game changer for us, and we're not doing like a generic, it's a database thing. We're doing it's Spanner, and we're using all the hooks that we can in it. We're also going full bore on on GKE on-prem, which is now called Anthos. The name hasn't stuck in my head yet, but we're going full bore on that as well. So we recommend going, embracing that the GCP is your provider and really go full bore on what they bring to the table. They invest a ton of money in this stuff, and it's worth using.
Yeah, we get asked this quite often is how do I architect my application so that I can quickly move from one cloud to the other? This was actually the same discussion we had back on in the database space. How can I build an application for this database but move it to any other? Our advice then is the same as it is now on cloud, which is if you architect your application properly and leverage native capabilities of the cloud, you will be better off than trying to do some heterogeneous shim layer that you can rapidly move from cloud to cloud. You'll never get there. You couldn't do it on database. I don't think you'll do it on, on cloud. So if you architect your apps properly, then you will spend less if you decide to move than trying to bet on the future of a move. Like commit to the platform that you're engineering on, and leverage the native components.
Yeah. And this last point, papers, please. So make sure that you're collecting the certificates as you decommission hardware. You may get audited, and having that paperwork is helpful. We did, and it was helpful. So how did we do? So we started at 15 million a year. We are currently at 4 million a year after 6 months. So we've saved 11 million already, which even factoring in the 3 million double bubble, it's more than paid for itself. And we're going to get to 1.5 million by next quarter. So that 90% target, we are going to hit it. And that's all in, right? That's including our GCP spend as well and the team that's dedicated to it. And if you look at all the different other metrics that I mentioned at the beginning, how many data centers, square footage, electricity, et cetera, we've cut between 80 and 100% on every one. But the big metric for us is cash out the door. And this has been enormously successful from that standpoint.
And these 10 data centers, that was sort of due to the serial acquiring nature of the business. That's how you got 10 data centers. That's how you had so many footprints, so many engineers.
Yeah. We ended up with, I think we had 3 data centers just in Germany, which we really didn't need. And we had 2 in India. We had 1 in Rio, and we had 1 in Kansas City, and it was just all, and Toronto. It was all over the place. And the ones in India were customer driven, but the other ones it came with the acquisitions. So takeaways: pick your partners carefully. Clearly, we like GCP and Pythian. Plan for the double bubble. It's going to happen, and if you aren't planning for it, it will bite you in the butt, and you'll have a bad time. Do set extreme goals. It forces the team to get creative. And initially, there's a little bit of a, oh my God, what the hell are you thinking? But it works out, And then own it at the C level if you want results like this.
Yeah, I'll just add color to the governed lift and shift, because I know that there is lift and shift has can have a bad connotation with it that can mean your CFO is not happy at the end of it. This was what was called a governed lift and shift. So a lot of house cleaning done beforehand. Again, owned at the C level, and then house clean. You could argue, I think Jamie, you did earlier, saying you could do this, you could have done this on-prem, but what we see is just people don't. There's no big rip in the fabric that causes you to actually, well, first get the money to do it, and secondly, paint a destination that's really compelling. So this is much like all digital transformation now really means cloud. And it's because you have the mandate to go through this. So clean it up. I mean, you didn't talk about it on the previous slide, but going from 50 OS instance types to support down to 7 is huge. Right? And that is makes a massive difference. The other piece, and I call this the surprise invoice that drives CFOs crazy. I mean, you guys were very frugal with who you gave rights to actually go spin up more assets. That's critical, because even if you land in your destination and the price is really good for February, if it blows up in March and April, then you haven't really achieved anything. So really figure out who needs the rights to set up those clusters, who needs those, and only give them out to people who are accountable to the business for that increased spend.
Yeah. And we did that right here because we've made that mistake on other deals. So it was a painfully learned lesson. And then the last point on here: monitor everything. Do be ruthless. And I can't stress enough. The default configuration will just be to monitor CPU, but you really want to monitor memory and disk utilization as well. And you want to have everything labeled so that you can quickly dive in and say, okay, I'm spending 2,000 more per day than I was expecting. Where did that come from? Okay, George, what's going on? Why are you suddenly spending more?